Bible Connection podcast. This is episode 46. We are just cooking right along, guys. So this week, this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan, and our goal is to just encourage you as you go through this Bible. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are a couple of my good friends, Taylor Babcock.
Hello.
And John Steike.
Hey there.
All right, so this week we are discussing the book of Habakuk. So John's going to head this one up. John, as we open up to the book of Habakuk, we see a conflicted man questioning God. My question is, who is Habakuk, and what is he asking?
So Habakuk is a really an interesting person to look at in the Bible because he's not really falling into any genre we're used to by itself. We've seen prophets, and we've seen people that are writing wisdom, and then we've seen people writing psalms. And Habakkuk is kind of blending all of these genres together because he's in a really difficult time in Israel's history. When I say Israel's history, Habakkuk is writing after the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed between 640 and 610 BC. Basically, we don't know the exact date, but we know he's writing around the reign of Manasseh in Judah. And Manasseh ruled for 50 years, so that's a huge range. And so when we're looking at Habakkuk, I think one of the best things we can do to understand what life was like in his day is to read a very small passage out of 2 Kings. It's about 8 verses that sums up life during the reign of King Manasseh. And so in 2 Kings chapter 21, beginning in verse 1, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hephzibah. I just kind of go with it when I say those names.
Works for me.
And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. He rebuilt the high places that Hezekiah his father destroyed. He erected altars for Baal and made an Asherah. So those are two different types of idols that he's reestablishing that had been removed from Judah. And as Ahab from Israel had done, he worshipped all of the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the house of the Lord, so right there in the temple, he built altars to these false idols, which the Lord said, "In Jerusalem I will put my name." He built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. He burned his son as an offering. He used fortune tellings and omens and dealt with mediums and necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. He carved an image of the Asherah that he made, and he set it in the house which the Lord gave to David and Solomon, and said, "In this house in Jerusalem that I've chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I'll put my name forever, and I'll not cause the feet of Israel to wander any more from the land of their fathers, if only they're careful to do what I've commanded them, according to the law of Moses, my servant." But they did not listen, and Manasseh led them astray to do more evil than the nations had done, whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. So we just got done with a podcast recording, Nahum, about God's judgment for Assyria for all of their wickedness, and another episode on Micah, where the people are being judged for their refusal to obey the law of Moses. But in Habakkuk's day, even more evil was being done in his day than any of the nations of Assyria or of all of the times that Israel had been failing.
After everything you just listed out, reading that, I cannot think of anything else that they possibly
could have been doing wrong. Yeah. They were being as wicked as possible. And in this day is where we get the second verse. "O Lord, how long do I need to cry out for help? And you won't hear. Or cry to you violence, and you will not save." Now, this should sound familiar. There's a lot of Psalms that actually sound this way in the book of Psalms, right? People saying, "How long, O Lord?" But what's going to be different about this is it's not just going to end with a song where he comes up to, he finds faith. The Lord's about to answer him. And that's very unique for the prophets. We have a lot of people who cry out to God and ask questions, and they're forced to search out the answers. The Lord is going to step down in love and answer Habakkuk. And his answer is going to be really astounding. He says, "Lord, why is there evil? Why is there oppression? Why is there so much wicked going on in my day?" Verse 4, right? "For the wicked surround the righteous. Justice goes forth perverted. The Lord answered, 'Look among the nations and see, Wonder and be astounded. I'm doing a work in your days that you wouldn't even believe it if I told you. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who marched the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own. Now, I'm not going to read the whole chapter to you, but what the Lord says is really crazy. It's nuts. Imagine the United States devolves into this kind of horribleness we saw in Manasseh's day. Every type of sin that we're seeing today that is just perverse and unjust, imagine it completely falls apart into dystopia, like, a movie like The Purge, like America's completely off the rails. And we cry out to the Lord for help, and the Lord's answer is, I'm going to raise up Vermont. I'm going to raise up Vermont to conquer the rest of it. His response in verse 12 is total confusion. Habakkuk responds, Lord, are you not the everlasting one, O Lord, the Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. You've ordained them as judgment, and you, O Rock, have established them as reproof. You who are purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at God. And he starts to build this picture, and he's like, Babylon's just going to be like people going fishing. They're not going to spare some fish that are good fish and some fish that are bad fish. They're just going to take it all. They're going to come through, and they're going to plunder the land. How is that not worse? How are you not just raising up a worse nation to come conquer than even the people who are doing the sinning? And the Lord's response, I think, is key to understanding all of the prophets, all of the minor prophets we've been reading. The Lord's going to explain himself and his reasoning to this prophet, which, can we just pause for a second and recognize how humbling that is, that the Lord was so gracious and so patient with him that he took the time to explain what he was doing. I'm so thankful that we have a God who cares that we understand and know his heart. So anyway, when we look at his response, he says, okay, get some stone, get a chisel, because what you're about to write down, you're never going to see it happen. But that doesn't mean that I need this to be forgotten. One day, people need to look back on what I'm about to tell you, and they're going to see that I said it ahead of time, okay? So get a chisel, get a stone, write it on stone. This is chapter 2, verse 2. Write it on tablets so that he who may read it, for still the vision awaits its appointed time. It's hastened to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. And what's his answer? The righteous shall live by faith.
Where have we heard that before?
We've heard it in Romans. We've heard it in Galatians. We've heard it in Hebrews. This is picked up on a lot in the New Testament because this is the answer to what we're supposed to respond to when we don't understand what's going on around us. You see, he was crying out for justice. Habakkuk was crying out for punishment on the wicked so that the righteous could stand. But the Lord is answering him, the righteous are not going to stand because I'm going to continually swoop in and make things easy. The righteous are going to live by faith. Paul uses this in Romans 1:17 to show the argument how God finds us to be justified by our faith, right? And then he uses it again in Galatians 3:11 to talk about how we have faith and we're justified by faith apart from works of the law. And the author of Hebrews uses this quote from Habakkuk to talk about how those who have belief, right, who trust God, do not draw back, right, but the righteous live by faith. And he's taking this idea, these people are taking this idea in the New Testament because what they're seeing is the Lord, in his justice, brings judgment on the wicked, and it's going to be difficult for the righteous. They're not just swooped away out of all the difficulty and life's going to be good, right? They need to live by faith. The righteous shall live by faith. And he didn't start to talk about what the judgment of Babylon is going to look like on Judah. There are 5 things that this nation who's coming in to judge Judah, that they also do that are sinful. There are 5 woes. If you remember me talking about woe in the book of Nahum, go back and listen to that so you can hear what a woe is. There are 5 woes, and these woes could stand for any nation throughout time, any empire that God uses to do his justice in the world. The things that they're doing, you can see in verses 6 through 8, they're thieves. Verses 9 through 11, they're greedy. Verses 12 through 14, they're violent. Verses 15 through 17, they're debauchery, right? The drunkenness, use of drugs, and hedonism. Verses 18 and following, idolatry. And what he's showing here is that even the nation that he's rising up to punish Judah, they themselves will one day be punished for their sin. The Lord is using wicked nations to punish his people, and one day they themselves will also be judged. And so ultimately, this is a really confusing response to the question, why is there sin? The Lord's response was, I'm going to raise up judgment over sin, and even the nation that's going to rise up in judgment is going to make things hard on the people that are righteous. But the ultimate conclusion that we should take from this is a psalm written in the 3rd chapter. This is the 3rd chapter of Habakkuk is just a psalm. I mean, it just looks just like the Psalms from the book of Psalms. It has a superscription at the top. It's got, at the end, it says, to the choir master with stringed instruments. This is literally just like a psalm that could have been in the book of Psalms, and we wouldn't have seen the difference. And he writes this prayer, and what he says is totally astounding. He began by begging the Lord for justice. And look what he says in verse 2. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. I do fear, so he's a believing prophet, not a doubting prophet anymore. In the midst of the years to revive it, in the midst of the years to make it known, in wrath, remember mercy. So Habakkuk has gone from a prophet who's questioning God to a prophet who's believing and trusting in God. He's fearing in God. And he's gone from a prophet begging for judgment, and now he's gone to a prophet who's pleading for mercy. He's starting to recognize his own sin. And I think that the key to understanding the rest of the book is the very last thing that's said in the book of Habakkuk. Though the fig tree should not blossom, verse 17, nor fruit be on the vines, and the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, and the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I'll take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He ends with trusting God. And this is the answer that we should have in all of life's questions and circumstances that don't make sense to us. How do we make sense of the suffering in the world? How do we make sense of the evil around us? The Lord is sovereign over all the oppression and sin and wickedness that's going on in the world. He will bring judgment in the end. We are called to live by faith, not by sight, and put our trust in the God who provides for us. And I think that's the message of Habakkuk.
Well said. Reading through this and listening to you just now, it just made me think about how God's justice is just in the way that he accomplishes what he's setting out to do is so much higher than our comprehension.
Yes.
That we just can't fathom what he's doing. And I heard it said once, the things of God are like trying to explain calculus to an ant. There's no way to explain in our finite minds how God does the things that he does. And Habakkuk is just an example of that. It makes me think about the way that God's doing things. There's just really no way to really fully comprehend in the flesh that we're in now.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's not like this is the first time God, reveals that he works in justice this way. Because the question has long been like, why is it that it's okay for the Israelites to come in and just slaughter the Canaanites and take over the land? How is that just? Well, if you remember all the way back to Genesis 15, when the land was promised to them, Abraham didn't take it immediately. I'll read it. Genesis 15, verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and a dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And the Lord said to Abram, know for certain your offspring will be sojourners in a land that's not there, and be servants and afflicted for 400 years. That's in Egypt, before the Exodus. And I will bring judgment on the nation they serve, Egypt, and afterward they shall come out in great possessions, Exodus. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, and be buried in a good old age. They shall come here in the 4th generation. Why? Why all of that time in Egypt? Why are the firstborn of Israel going to be slaughtered by the Pharaoh? Why the plagues? Why the Exodus? Why not just give the land to Abram now? Look at verse 16. For the iniquity of the Amorites isn't complete. The Lord is sovereign over the nations, and he knows the wicked. And he's not giving the land of the Canaanites to Israel in that day because it would not yet be just for Abram to go in and conquer them. He's using his people in justice to conquer the sinfulness of the Amorites and all of the idolatry and wickedness that we've talked about in previous episodes of the child sacrifice and all of these horrible things that they were committing. He was allowing the judgment to store up on them before he sent his people in to conquer them. And the Lord's doing the same when we read the book of Habakkuk with Babylon. Babylon's going to be brought in to judge Judah for their wickedness, but Babylon's going to be judged for the woe that's on them. And the Lord is sovereignly control over all of these nations as he brings justice for the righteous and for the oppressed.
Absolutely. And I'm looking through Habakkuk, and he's asking questions, and God is so graciously answering and putting into language that is understandable of what he's doing. Habakkuk at this time lived alongside a lot of false prophets.
Yes.
The false prophets make it very difficult, not just for Habakkuk, but just anybody living during that time to know actually what's happened. And I think one of the messages was that, well, you're God's people. God's not going to bring judgment from another nation. He's not going to take his chosen people and have them judged or have another nation to come rule over them or wipe them out. That was a message of the false prophet. So I think that during that time there had to have been confusion on top of everything else.
And this brings
going
correction.
on. And yeah, this brings clarity. This allows for a concise understanding of what is true and what's not.
Absolutely.
Another way I think Habakkuk reads, it's almost like kind of like a personal journal. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, for sure.
we
He's
see
writing
this-
down his thoughts.
we see this idea of, he's complaining in his suffering. And then we have this time of he's listening to what God has to tell him.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see this prayer, right? Like this is how we're meant to go through this life. God promises there will be suffering,
Yes.
right? But there is redemption in the end if you listen and you're faithful. And through what's that the one that's quoted in the New Testament, steadfast.
You're talking about the righteous shall live by
the
faith.
righteous shall live by faith. Like
Yeah.
this idea that like when God calls us to step on the waters, that's when we're living by that faith. We are promised to be changed.
Yeah. I think this is the most pragmatic prophet in the Bible. In your life circumstances, doesn't matter what kind of nation you're living in, you can see a little bit of yourself in Habakkuk and see how he learns to go from a doubting man to a man who's trusting in God, a man who's crying out for punishment. He's like, remember the mercy. And I loved what you said before we hit play on the podcast. His name, like, what does it mean?
Hugs.
Yeah, his name means hugs. Like, this is literally like an embrace, a hug from the Lord is what we should think of when we think of the person
hugs.
Habakkuk.
Yeah. All right, that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Bible Connection podcast. So I just want to say thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen. We're just trying to help encourage and equip you guys as you read. So if you want to, leave a comment on YouTube if you have any questions, or you can send us an email to the question or with your questions to the email on screen. I just hope you guys have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 47.